All right, good evening. Thank you all for joining us. It's great to see so many of you here, and I hope that, like me, you're looking forward to learning a lot in the course of this conversation. We're really grateful to have these terrific members of our faculty here to lead a conversation about Charlottesville. Tony Thompson, Kim Taylor-Thompson, Bert Newborn, and Brian Stevenson, who's just flown up just ahead of the hurricane to make it here. So will you join me to start just by recognizing and thanking these faculty members for leading this conversation. We're going to do our best to have this be a true conversation, and so I'll kick it off with a question, and from time to time we'll prompt with another, but we hope and expect that there'll be lots of interaction among these four, giving their thoughts on the various events that could be collected under the title of Charlottesville. Why don't I just begin by asking each of you to tell us what was your first reaction to what you saw happening in Charlottesville?
Well, I mean, for me, working in Montgomery, Alabama, it wasn't startling to me to know that we were going to again see the evidence of our historic failure to deal honestly with the legacy of racial inequality in this country. I mean, I think Charlottesville is a symptom of a larger disease. And the disease is that we are burdened in this country by a history of racial inequality. I really don't even think we're free in this country, that our history of racial inequality has created a kind of smog that we all breathe in, that creates conflict and tension, and we have moments where that tension is made dramatic, as it was in Charlottesville, but it's always there. And I think when we have these dramatic manifestations of it, we have a hard time getting our minds around it, and that's what I saw happening in Charlottesville. It didn't strike me as particularly newsworthy or eventful. I think the president's comments put it in a slightly different category, because historically when you have extremism in any place, but certainly extremism from people who are self-identifying as Nazis or members of the Ku Klux Klan, we've learned that you're supposed to say that is unacceptable. That is wrong. That is not core to our values. And when the president didn't say that, the manifestation of this problem became, I think, much more serious and much more significant. And so, for me, it just creates one more opportunity to deal with these underlying problems we have in this country about how to recover from a history of slavery and lynching and segregation and putting Japanese Americans in concentration camps and demonizing people because of their color. And for me, that's still the paramount question that we have to answer if we're going to make forward progress.
Kim?
Yeah, I guess I agree with everything that Brian says, which is not unusual. But I wasn't surprised. I didn't feel an emotion that was, an emotion of shock. I was outraged and I was angry, and particularly as I saw people marching shamelessly and brazenly and saying the things that they were saying without any feeling that they needed to hide their faces or feel any shame about it. So that made me angry. And then my anger turned to heartbreak when that move to create some sort of racial terror turned into murder the next day. And it just broke your heart to see something like that happen. But I wasn't surprised, because we had, and I certainly wasn't one of those people who said, how could this happen in 2017? Because we've been seeing things like this throughout my entire life, and we certainly have been seeing an uptick in hate crimes, an uptick in racialized violence, an uptick in the kinds of hate speech that creates a foundation for this kind of activity. So I wasn't surprised. I was sickened by it. I felt tired, and I find that I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so what it said to me was that we need to do a lot more work and it's work that we've been doing. But I think what Charlottesville did was it just took a Band-Aid off of what is the festering sore of racism in this country. And as Brian suggested, we don't pay any attention to that festering sore, or not sufficient attention to it. And so maybe this makes us look at it.
Well, for me, there was a chronology. Question, how did I think about it before I learned about the murder? And how did I think about it afterwards? Before, I was treating it as a kind of normal event. As both Kim and Brian pointed out, it doesn't surprise me that there would be a manifestation of racism in this country. And it doesn't surprise me that there would be strong counter demonstrators trying to speak out against it. I've seen that in my life as an ACLU lawyer a lot of times. It was to me just another in a long series of events like that. And in some perverse sense, and I hope people don't misunderstand this, I almost welcomed it, because I was afraid that the upsurge in racism and Nazism and anti-Semitism that was so on display in those television pictures all over the country, I was afraid that people were ignoring it, and that people didn't think it happened in 2017. I knew it was there. We all know that it's perking down under the surface, and getting it out into the sunlight struck me as being a way to start dealing with the countermeasures that had to be made. And then, of course, there was the murder. Then the crazy guy drives the car into a crowd and kills a wonderful young woman. And at that point, everything dissolves. At that point, you're not talking about anything that law can deal with. There's no way you're going to stop a madman from getting into a car and killing people. We're learning that in Europe. We learn it here. And it transformed Charlottesville for me into a kind of sort of desperate question of how we're going to control the worst elements among us if they're going to use force. And then the next day, and this is just a technical thing, this is from someone who's done this a lot of times, I said to myself, where on earth are the cops? The only way, in my experience, the only way you deal with this kind of passionate counter-demonstrators in a relatively small space is that you count on the good sense of the police to have a massive presence there. Not a militarized presence, but a massive presence that will dissuade the crazies on either side from engaging in violence. And the Charlottesville police were absent. They were just absent. And so to me, it's a failure at lots of different levels, but I ascribe, not the murder. I don't blame the murder on anybody except a crazy person. But the fact that so many people were hurt and that there was so much violence, good local administration can minimize that, and it didn't happen in Charlottesville.
Yeah, I had a little different response. I think that first I should say that this was such a personal event for some of us. We're still forming kind of our conclusions about it. But I think that the preconditions for Charlottesville have been growing for some time. And I think that the last election, and I think that some of the public discourse, we called it during the election process a coarsening of the debate, the national debate, but it was more than that. It was the unveiling of a white supremacist philosophy that was allowed to come to the surface. And so having individuals who at one point in our history would feel like they needed to march with a hood, instead marching with tiki torches and chanting, set a different tone, I think, for the country. And I think that the issue for Charlottesville is really a fundamental issue in this democracy. And it's a fundamental issue about the morals and values of this country. And so I think that it is a turning point. I think that it is significant. And I think that our response, our collective response, is going to really determine kind of where we go as a nation right now. And I think there's been a considerable vacuum of leadership. And that's what set the tone for a lot of this. And so I think that as we move forward, thinking about how we will respond and what is the tone as a nation we want to set, are the most important questions that we can ask about it.
So Tony, part of your answer highlights something else I wanted to ask about, which is, of course, race has always been a fault line in this country. racial injustice is a fault line, is a theme in this country's history. Much of Brian's work is devoted to the effort to ensure that there's broader public recognition of that history than is often the case. Yet at the same time, I think many of us feel, and I think maybe I heard you say, that in recent years, there seems to be a even added salience to race, that there's an increasing focus on race. I guess the question is, do you agree with that? Is that how you would talk about, and racism, is that how you think about the recent past? Is that part of the context that informs your thinking about Charlottesville? And if so, or if not, why?
Well, let me say that, you know, we as a nation, in the founding of this nation, never have dealt with the fundamental questions of race, and we've continued not to do that. And so inequality, housing discrimination, wealth inequality in the country, and the criminal justice system and mass incarceration are in part a function of our inability to deal with the question of race. Race is a social construct, and so it's used by one power group to disenfranchise and disempower another. And our inability to deal with race as a nation has led to this precondition. Do I think that because of media and because of the current electoral cycle and what has happened, is race more salient? Yes. The one thing I want to say is that for a lot of people, this notion of race is that it's something separate than the substantive work. So we can say, and I've heard it said in this institution, oh, he's a great judge, or he's a great prosecutor, he's a great cop, he's also a racist. And for many of us, we believe that those are inseparable, that you cannot pull apart someone's approach to white supremacy and the substantive work that they do.
And can I just add to that? I mean, because I do think that there is a historical force behind the conditions that haunt America. I think we're a post-genocide society, and we haven't done the things you're supposed to do when you're a post-genocide society to get better, to recover. I think when white settlers came to this continent and they killed millions of native people through famine and war and disease, it was a genocide, but we didn't call it a genocide. We said that these native people are savages, and we created this narrative of racial difference to justify this abuse. And for me, that narrative of racial difference was the true evil of American slavery. We had moments that had starts and ends, but we never really confronted the narrative of racial difference that we used to justify slavery. We said black people are different than white people. They're not fully human. They can't do this. They can't do that. They got the courts to say they're 3/5 human. And for me, that was the true evil of American slavery. And the 13th Amendment talks about ending involuntary servitude and ending forced labor, but it doesn't say anything about ending this ideology of white supremacy, which was at the heart of the problem. And so that beginning and end doesn't really apply there. And then we had decades of terrorism and lynching, black people pulled out of their homes, murdered, burned alive, slaughtered, and it caused millions of people to flee the South. And we don't understand in this country that the demographic geography of America was shaped by racial terrorism. The black people in Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland didn't go there as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They went there as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. And then we had the Civil Rights era. And once again, I think courageous, heroic people won passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But the South and those who believe in white supremacy, they won the narrative war because we never held people accountable for holding up those signs that said segregation forever. And now we're living in an era where that same thinking, that same dynamic is shaping the political environment and the economic environment. And when you keep losing the narrative battle and we don't really deal with this force, it's like a mudslide that just keeps building up. And at some point, there is this release. And I think that if we don't do better, we're going to continue to see this increase. People thought, oh, Barack Obama got elected president in 2008. We're now in a post-racial society. I haven't heard anybody talk about a post-racial society in a long time. No. And that's because I think we recognize some things now that we were unwilling to recognize then, which I think adds to the intensity of this problem. And the other thing I think makes it salient in ways that we haven't confronted. I'm going to say more than I should. Tony and I went to law school, so I really should be careful of it. But I'm going to tell you that I am 57 years old.
Thanks, Brian.
Don't go there, Brian.
I'm trying not to. I started my education in a colored school in the rural South, and lawyers came into our community and enforced Brown versus Board of Education, and they opened up the schools. And but for those lawyers coming into our community, I wouldn't be sitting here. I came in, I'm a product of the civil rights movement, and a lot of people thought, oh, the world's going to get better. And I went to college, and I went to law school, and I've been practicing law. And when I went to elementary school, the challenge I had to face was that there was a presumption that I wasn't like the other kids, I was dangerous, I was guilty. And that same presumption of dangerousness and guilt still exists today for black boys who are born in America. They're still dealing with that same presumption. I'm 57, I'm still dealing with that same presumption. I was in a court not too long ago, getting ready to do a hearing. I had my suit and tie on, sitting at defense counsel's table, and the judge walked in and saw me sitting there, and he said, hey, you get back out there in the hallway, you wait until your lawyer gets here. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I stood up and I said to the judge, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing, the prosecutor started laughing. I made myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client. And then my client came in, we did the hearing. Client was a young white kid I was representing. But after the hearing, I was thinking, what is it when this judge saw a middle-aged black man sitting in a suit and tie at defense counsel's table? It didn't even occur to him what's the lawyer. That's the lawyer. And what that is this narrative of racial difference, this presumption. And the reason why I think things are salient for me is that you get tired constantly having to navigate these presumptions. I'm starting to get weary of having to bob and weave around all of these assumptions, and it breaks my heart when I see young law students starting in this law school having to negotiate these presumptions, and my young clients having to negotiate. It's exhausting, and it does build this kind of anxiety and angst. And that's what I think we see on display now, and it will continue to be there until we do something responsive, something restorative, something truthful that gets us to a better place.
And I think we have to tackle race head on. I think that it needs to be salient. I think that we need to deal with it explicitly, because when we don't, it goes underground and it mutates. And if we don't address it up front, then we have instances where we've got this white supremacist ideology that is allowed to persist and pervade our society, and we don't confront it. One of the things that white supremacy is based on is what Brian was talking about a moment ago, this notion that you are above other people. And part of the way that you do that is you dehumanize everyone else, right? If you think about dehumanization from warfare, for example, one of the reasons that you can allow people to kill the enemy is that you dehumanize that enemy. You call that enemy vermin, and when you do that, Nazi Germany is capable of exterminating people. You talk about people infesting communities, and you can wipe them out and go through ethnic cleansing. What we see in this country is dehumanization that happens on a regular basis, and we don't even notice it anymore, and that's what's troubling. Brian was talking about the fact that when President Obama was in office for 8 years, and we had, our first black president, First Lady, who was a woman of color, she was called an ape in heels, right? He was treated with levels of disrespect that no other president has had to endure, because we were allowed to, as a society, to dehumanize, to say that they were some sort of other. And that dehumanization continues to this day. If you go back to Ferguson, when you had the demonstrations, black demonstrators demonstrating against the killing of Michael Brown, there was an explosion on Twitter where people were reacting to black protesters in Ferguson, and they were using the hashtag chimping out. And for those of you who don't know this, I had to look it up. The Urban Dictionary says chimping out is when black people let down the facade of civility and let out their inner primate. This is what we're seeing in social media, that people are dehumanizing, and when you start to dehumanize, you feel like you can act violently, you can act with disrespect, you can behave in racialized ways, and if we don't call it out, it continues to happen. One of the things that happened that Friday night in Charlottesville, when those men were walking with torches and chanting the things that they were, when they walked by black counter-protesters, they made monkey sounds. Again, living this dehumanization or reigniting this dehumanization. We've got to confront this, because if we don't confront this, what ends up happening is that we pretend that race isn't in play. We pretend that race isn't a default line, and we continue to see the kinds of violent activities that we're seeing. We have to confront it openly. It has to be salient. We have to be explicit.
I'm going to disagree that this is new, that somehow Charlottesville and the last couple of years, what's new, of course, is that you have a president that reacts inappropriately, worse, fans the flames, pours gasoline on them. But the underlying story of race and the subordination of people of color in the country, it's not new. I grew up, I'll tell you that my age has got a bunch of sevens in it also, but I won't tell you in what order they come. I grew up in a segregated America, and then in those years, it was quite common to hear extraordinarily offensive racial epithets. I never dressed in an athletic locker room that wasn't full of that all the time as I grew up. Every single day I heard it. I remember Ku Klux Klan marching in the streets and intimidating people with extraordinary force. So the idea that somehow this is an upsurge of something that electing a black president caused, and so somehow it's a reaction to the election of a black president, simply is ahistorical. The truth is, under the surface of the veneer of American society has bubbled a kind of a series of stereotypes about the treatment of women, stereotypes about the treatment of Jews, stereotypes about Asians, stereotypes about blacks. We have been a nation of stereotypes, and we've, I think, striven as lawyers to deal formally with eliminating them, and we've made tremendous strides in the formal elimination. What Charlottesville teaches me is that you can eliminate the formal stereotypes, but the underlying pathology that exists in the minds and hearts of people has to be dealt with by some form of direct confrontation. And I don't mean violence, and I don't mean imprisoning them, and I don't mean shutting them up, but I do mean confronting them, and confronting the racism and the sexism and the anti-Semitism that continues to bubble under the surface. So Charlottesville is a warning sign, but it's not something new.
So there's a lot that you've said there that we should come back to, each of you. But to pick up with this question of shutting them up or not, Bert, I mean, one aspect...
I knew I was going to...
Yeah.
I should have shut up.
No. One aspect of Charlottesville, one dimension of it, is to think of it as a problem about the boundaries between free speech and violence, about what it means to have right on the one hand under the First Amendment, to be free from being silenced by the state for what you're saying, or what you believe, and at the same time to have a right to security of the person that is an obligation, if not constitutionally enshrined, at least expected of our government for its people. So we could come at this a number of different ways. One way is to ask the institutional question. You've spent a lot of time working with the ACLU, which made the decision to represent some of those protesting with, and some of those who are among the neo-Nazis and Klansmen in litigation arising out of the events in Charlottesville. Is that a straightforward, one can hate their speech but recognize their right to speak? How do you think about these boundaries?
Well, as I have often said, I know the questions. It's the answers I have trouble with. Let me start by saying, and I don't mean this is just rhetoric, there's no such thing as free speech. Speech is not free. First of all, you need resources to engage in it in an effective way. So at that end of the equation, free speech is a misnomer. But also the idea that speech is free because it doesn't have any adverse consequences is also wrong. Speech does have adverse consequences. Although speech matters, otherwise we wouldn't care about it so much. Speech can actually change behavior and cause people to behave in certain ways. So there's no question that when somebody like me in the ACLU and my friends in the ACLU, when we defend this type of speech, we are defending speech that can hurt people, and we know it. None of us hide from that. It's harmful, it's hurtful. I've been the target of enough anti-Semitic slurs to know that it's hurtful and harmful. But consider what, and here is, maybe this is a cop-out, but I don't think so. Consider the consequences. You would have to have a rule that said, if speech, one, makes people feel really bad, you can stop it. I don't think there's a person in this room that would go for that. Now, that would be a dreadful rule that said that the hurt feelings are a basis to essentially license the state to control what people say. So if we take hurt feelings off, then we have to ask ourselves, all right, the question is, what is the speech going to unleash? Now, we in this country have lived through two long cycles. We lived through a very long cycle where the rule was, if the speech has a bad tendency to unleash something, which means that if it sort of has it could do it, we don't know that it will, but it could do it, the government can shut you up. And what that gave us is the imprisonment of Eugene Debs for opposing the First World War. It gave us the Red Scare. It gave us the imprisonment of American labor leaders for urging people to be able to strike. It gave us McCarthyism. It gave us the worst excesses of tyranny that the country has known have been carried out under the bad tendency test. We moved away from the bad tendency test to a test that says it's not enough that there's a bad tendency. You have to prove that it's going to virtually certain create something really bad before the government can step in and stop it. Now, to me, that means that it would be okay for a park to say, I'm not giving you a permit because the risk of violence is so great based upon all of the facts and circumstances that if we allow this to go on, there is a very strong likelihood that there will be violence and people will be hurt. I'm prepared, even as an ACLU lawyer, and I'm not sure that all of my friends would agree with me, but I'm prepared to provide some degree of good faith effort to stop violence. But I am not prepared to let people in the park say, oh no, this is going to cause violence, because I heard it too many times when I was working in the South representing civil rights marchers. Every time we planned a march, some sheriff somewhere said there's going to be violence. And if it weren't for federal judges enforcing the Constitution and guaranteeing people's right to speak, you wouldn't have had a civil rights movement. It would have been crushed. And so don't be ahistorical. Don't think that this is the moment where you can snuff out speech you don't like, but later go back and put speech you like back on a pedestal. That's the cost of free speech, that you have to endure things you don't like. And then the quid pro quo is uniting with the victim to fight that speech, but to fight it not with the government, but to fight it by common work that deals with the inequality.
Let me respond in two ways to that. One, I think that no one would believe that people who were armed with weapons and tiki torches intending to do harm when they marched on that park were due constitutional protections, but that's a separate issue. When we talked earlier about us not dealing with race as a nation, we didn't mean only the neo-Nazis and Klansmen haven't dealt with race. We meant everyone. And I think that the exercise for the ACLU to look at this time in history and say, we should reevaluate not only who we are, but how we approach these problems, given the racial history of this country, is a healthy exercise. And so I think that as difficult as it is, I think looking at the chapters and looking at the national structure and looking at the demographics of the organization are helpful exercises for the ACLU. And I think Charlottesville has helped to engage in that exercise.
I do think there is a, for me, it's about power, who has it, where are rights really being threatened and menaced. I mean, what's interesting is that, I obviously support a group's right to protest, to march, to say things. In 90% of Virginia, the Klan and the Nazis could have gotten a permit to protest in a park, and nobody would have objected to that. They happen to be at a university community where there's a different consciousness about that. I mean, we have this, I live in Montgomery, I mean, this happens all the time. I can't drive 20 miles without crossing somebody's protest with people with machine guns and Confederate flags and all of this iconography. So I think there's a more complicated question for me, which is, where are their threats? I'm very worried about all these young people who get arrested when they pull out their phones and start recording police officers interacting with minority suspects. I'm worried about the way in which this implicit bias is being expressed in ways to kind of keep people silent. And so there has to be this analysis of how we're going to use these resources. And that's why I think for me, it's not about a constitutional question about rights. It's about, where are we worried that rights are going to be violated and people are going to be silenced and oppression is going to be unaddressed. And that's why, in a lot of ways, and I've said this before, I'm not really worried about the people wearing white robes, prancing around with torches, calling themselves the Ku Klux Klan. I'm worried about the people wearing black robes, getting on benches, sentencing people in racially discriminatory manners, doing all of these things with implicit bias, condemning people, and not ever being confronted by it. That's a much bigger threat for me. And in that respect, when I have power and resources, I want to deploy it to protect the rights of all of these people who are being silenced by their very presence in a courtroom where nobody's asking these questions about whose rights are at risk.
I suppose what goes along with recognizing, as I think we all do, the rights of groups to gather and to say things, chant things, to announce beliefs and views that we would all regard as repugnant, is an obligation of the state to protect the people. And so that raises a question about the role of the police. Kim, I think it might have been you who referenced Ferguson earlier. One rather sharp contrast one can draw between events in Ferguson and events in Charlottesville is the question of whether the police were even visible, let alone what they were doing. How do you think about that?
Well, I think that if we imagine for a moment 250 black people armed and with torches walking through the streets of Virginia, I don't think that we would have seen the police just step back and say, well, we'll let what happens happen. And we saw evidence of what police do in Ferguson, where they came out with tanks, they had submachine guns, they were militarized, and it almost behaved as though they were occupying the community where these protests were happening. We see a different form of policing when it's black folks protesting and when it's white folks protesting, and I think that it raises questions about how it is that we deploy police, what it is that they believe that they're supposed to be doing, who it is they believe that they're supposed to be protecting. And so I think that if we look at the differences, they're stark. And I think that they tell us something about who we are and how we behave, particularly when we're using state power. And frankly, if you look at, Brian and all of us were talking earlier about how the president has rescinded the executive order that President Obama put in place, which was designed to keep military equipment out of the hands of police officers. And what this president is doing is sending it into the hands of police officers so that they have rocket launchers and things like that. That's the kind of policing that we feel is somehow appropriate for people of color and communities of color. And in or in white communities, or when there are white protesters, we're willing to restrain ourselves. I think it's telling.
The police in Boston and San Francisco reacted quite well. Major demonstrations in both places in the weeks after the tragedy, and strong presence of white supremacists in both places, shouted down by massive numbers of counter-protesters. And the police kept them apart. There was a couple of punches thrown, but not a significant amount of violence. And if you want a primer on how to behave, it seems that's it. The narrow and the broader questions that have been raised on the panel transcend Charlottesville. But if you want a narrow question of how you deal with the particular problem of Charlottesville, how to deal with white racists and anti-Semites publicly parading their pathology on the streets, you do it by surrounding them with cops and by encouraging the community to come out and let them know how absolutely unacceptable this type of behavior is. You know, I'll just raise the ACLU flag one more time, and then I'll hide behind the chair. And that is, you don't do it by silencing them. You don't do it by telling them that they can't speak, because if you do, you are driving the pathology underground. It will continue to ferment. They will turn themselves into martyrs. And we won't be able to deal with the basic issues that the panel is raising, and that is how we confront the fact that racism is, I don't know, Derek Bell used to tell me racism is baked into us. It's hardwired. We're never going to get rid of it, and we just better learn how to control it. But whatever it is, Charlottesville tells me that we haven't done enough to deal with that, but not that we should try to use censorship as a way of dealing with this.
There's another angle we could come at Charlottesville from. Ostensibly, and I underline that word, the event started as a protest about the removal of a statue. Now, anyone who believes that Charlottesville, in the larger sense, is principally about the presence or absence of a statue might want to give some additional thought to that proposition. But there are, I suppose, questions here, and Brian, thinking about your work around public memory in particular, how should we think about this? That this country, like many countries, but we can just think about this country, and not only in the South, is decorated with memorials to people who played leading roles in the preservation and propagation of one of the greatest evils in human history, the institution of slavery. What should we do about that? Is the best thing to remove them? Does that run a risk of causing even further public memory loss with regard to that history? How should we think about it?
Yeah, I really do not think that the way we have to remind ourselves about the Civil War and the era of slavery is to put up statues to Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and Jefferson Davis. Today is September 11. It's an important day in the life of this country and the life of this city. We have a 9/11 memorial less than 15 years after that tragedy. No one thinks that the appropriate way to remember is to have a statue of Osama bin Laden down at Wall Street. We would think that's crazy. And if any country now tried to honor him with something like that, we would be so provoked by it, we'd be talking sanctions and war. And so I think we actually have to reevaluate what these statues represent. They don't represent an effort to just honor people. They represent an effort to assert a narrative. Remember, the South could be those men were properly identified as treasons, insurgents who could have and should have been hanged, right? That was the argument. And that didn't happen. And then when Reconstruction collapses, you have this takeover, a violent takeover of the American South. Black people are now going to be disenfranchised. They're going to be forced back into racial subordination. And the way we're going to make that takeover visible and celebrated is we're going to erect these new memorials and monuments and statues. And they were being erected at the same time we were passing state constitutions, like the one we have in Alabama that still today prohibits black and white kids from going to school together, a provision we can't get out of the statute because you have to have a statewide referendum, and we haven't been able to get a majority of people in the state of Alabama to vote to take out the language that prohibits black and white kids from going to school together. So when these things are erected to do something that is expressive about white supremacy and racial hierarchy, I don't think they can be justified by arguing that if we take them down, we'll forget our history. And in that respect, I think they are very, very dangerous. I think they are very, very oppressive. I live in a region where the iconography of hate and bigotry is everywhere. And in my state, where Confederate Memorial Day is a state holiday, where Jefferson Davis's birthday is a state holiday, where we don't have Martin Luther King Day, we have Martin Luther King / Robert E. Lee Day, there is something burdensome and oppressive about that reality. Our two largest high schools are Robert E. Lee High, Jefferson Davis High. They're both 99% black. And so I think we have to change. I think this country has to change, and we need our culture to express that change. It's the reason why we're trying to build this national memorial to victims of lynching. It's the reason why I want to put a marker at every lynching site in America to change our public memory in a different way. What I like about what's happened in Germany is that if you go to Berlin, you can't go 100 meters without seeing stones placed next to the homes of Jewish families that were abducted. In Germany, every school child has to go to the Holocaust Memorial. There is this effort to reclaim, to change the identity. They don't want to be thought of Nazis and the people who killed the Jews. They want to change that identity. But in this country, we don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation. And we actually like being identified as the Confederates. And so that has to change. And now we have people in the North defending these Confederate statues. So I think not only are they not neutral, not just about memory, I actually think they're toxic. They are contributing to the mindset that keeps us silent about the things we should be talking about. And one of the interesting things that we've been working on, and we have a list in my office of white Southern abolitionists in the 1850s who were trying to end slavery, Southerners, white Southerners. We have a list of people who were white Southern activists in the 1920s trying to stop lynching. We have white Southern politicians in the 1940s who were speaking out against segregation and Jim Crow. And if I brought that list and put their names on the screen, nobody would have ever heard of any of these people. And the reason for that is we haven't actually honored them. And I think we should be naming some schools and streets after those people. Name it after these white Southerners who oppose slavery, and then we could all celebrate that. Then you'd have something that actually reflects public memory in a healthy way that moves us forward. What these things do, I think, is hold us back. And so I think it's important that we actually address this issue in a much more honest way than we have to date.
When I was in college, a lot of Southern students from the South had Confederate flags in their room, in their dorm rooms. And their notion was this narrative that, this was this noble cause by the South that was just lost. And in contemporary times, it's confined to this notion of an economic struggle. This was really an economic struggle. This was an attempt to destroy the United States of America and to prolong slavery. And we need to, when Brian talks about the narrative, and we talked about that at the launch of the center, and we've talked about it since, the narrative war, what the story is told, that is told. I've seen in the South some courageous leaders. Nikki Haley, when she was governor of South Carolina, was willing to have the Confederate flag taken off government property. And I think part of this discussion is how we shape that narrative. What these statues mean and what it means to fly the Confederate flag. And I think we haven't really embraced the reality of that narrative. So I think we need to be careful about people who say they're offended because it talks about this noble cause.
Yeah, I think the points on public iconography, to me, those public statues that essentially reinforce and codify a false narrative of past, especially the past in the South, but you could do it in the North too, is more dangerous than the white supremacist marching. Because the white supremacist marching is not going to capture the national narrative. What we need to do is use their march as a trigger for the national narrative to reject them. But the statues that are up there speaking all the time, it strikes me every time I think about that the Catholic Church dominated Europe partly because they recognized that building those churches, those magnificent churches that dominated the skyline and dominated what people saw all the time, was one of the most important ways to send a message that would move a population in a particular way. And so that the public narrative of public monuments, and interestingly enough, the Supreme Court blundered into it by saying that there's something called the government speech doctrine. When the government decides to put up a monument on property, it's the government speaking to you and telling you some sort of narrative about it. So for me, there are two possible ways to go. One way is a tactical way is the way I would go, and try to use the existing statues to the fullest extent as teaching moments. It seems to me that 3 times a year, 5 times a year, school children should be bused to the Robert E. Lee statue. and they should discuss what it is about this nation that would have us glorify Lee. When in fact there's this terrible narrative that glorifying Lee seems to cover up. Whether people would do that, I don't know. The alternative is to take them down. Now that's going to be a tremendously divisive event. It seems to me it's appropriate to take them down, and or else, if you don't want to take it down, at least put one of the white heroes in the South, or heaven forbid, one of the black heroes in the South. Put them next to these other statutes. But I do think we shouldn't be just tricked. I fell into it myself when I first heard about it. I said, no, we're overreacting. The statutes don't really do much. Leave them alone. I'm tired of government by symbolism. Let's do something that really matters in people's lives. I've been persuaded that's wrong. I've been persuaded that the message that these monuments send, reinforcing racism, that until we begin to deal with our public iconography, and we know this in the Establishment Clause, we spend vast amounts of time worrying about what the public square looks like with crosses and various religious symbols, but not one iota of time worried about the racism that gets projected in the public square every day.
Yeah.
And we're teaching our children what to revere, what to look up to by having this I will say statute. It's the lawyer in me.
No, it's the New Yorker in me.
It is. Having these statues in our town squares, our town centers, we are signaling a value system and teaching our children that this is something that they should pay attention to. So I think they come down. I think that doesn't change our history. We can still talk about these things. We can still put those little statues in museums, but they don't need to be in our town centers. We don't need to have it at our state capitol, because that's sending a message that I think is a divisive message and a message of subordination.
Yeah, and can I just add one more thing on this? Because I was where Bert was, and I appreciate his intervention on this, because I initially thought, well, we can do something else. But I'm now with Kim on this. I don't think we can just erect something else, because what that tends to do is it makes slavery a debate. It makes lynching debatable. And one of the great challenges that we have in this country is people are still debating that. Michelle Obama got up at the Democratic National Convention and said, I work in a house built by slaves. People went after her and started talking about how great things were for black people during slavery. And as long as we're debating the inhumanity of slavery, we're debating the inhumanity of lynching, we're not going to make the progress we're going to make. The other thing I want to say before we leave, because we're in New York City, and some people are sitting out there thinking, yeah, I'm glad I don't live in Alabama. But Alabama and New York City have a common statute, right? We have on our state legislature at Alabama an Alabamian who is heralded as the father of gynecology. He also has a statute right here in New York City, James Sims. And he's heralded as the father of gynecology. And he was a doctor in Alabama who, during the period of enslavement, went to plantations and basically butchered enslaved black women. He cut on them when they were having problems during pregnancy. He did not believe that black people felt pain, so he refused to use anesthesia. The screaming and the hollering and the tears wasn't enough to persuade him that they were feeling pain. And he did these brutal, incredibly violent assaults on black women for decades, until he learned some things about how to treat vaginal trauma and some of these issues. And then he applied that to white women, where he used anesthesia, and he's now heralded as the father of gynecology. And there is a statue of him in New York City where we have not really confronted that. And I think the same issues that we're talking about, as Bert said, in the American South exist all over this country. There is a continuum, but I do think that these things are important places for us to do this really hard education that we haven't done to date.
We're running a little short on time for maybe another round, and maybe we can pivot now to what to do. What can lawyers do? Wow, some people are running very short on time. What can law students do? What can the law do?
Well, I tell you, what can you do? for me, the personal obligation, and I bear this as a personal obligation because I do believe in free speech so deeply, and I do believe that one fights censorship whenever one can. But for any lawyer who really believes that, there's a reciprocal. And the reciprocal is you can't be a free rider. You say that free speech is good for the society, and you don't trust the government to censor, and therefore you're going to protect some of the most god-awful stuff you've ever heard. And it's going to come out, and some people will be harmed by it. But you think the society is in some sense better off, and you're a member of that society, so you fight for that free speech. If you do that, there's a quid pro quo. The quid pro quo is you cannot enjoy freedom without helping to pay its price. And part of the price of free speech is to rally to the victims who feel oppressed by the particular speech. For me, I've said this more often than anybody wants to hear. The way I deal with problems of free speech on campus is I try to organize the students into saying, when you hear somebody delivering hateful speech to one of your colleagues, you rally around that colleague. You let that colleague know that that speech is unacceptable. Maybe you're not going to punish the person that spoke, but you're not going to walk away. And so to those of you in the audience, to those 3 or 4 of you in the audience who agree with my free speech position, don't walk away. You're not allowed to. You have a special duty to work on behalf of the victims.
Let me take those in order, right? So with regard to the law, I think that white supremacy is allowed to exist and to flourish because we still have throwbacks in the law. So beginning to construct arguments that will destroy the precedents around Washington v. Davis, for example. Because now in order to prove discrimination, you essentially have to have someone who uses a racial slur in their record. So beginning to think about legal constructs that take on that notion is, I think, things that the law can do and that we can do as concerned lawyers. For my law students in the room, it's simple. My colleague, Vincent Sutherland, who is very thoughtful and works with me every day, always says, we know people who say things that are racist or inappropriate, and not allowing those to go unchecked, whether it's somebody in your family, whether it's somebody you know, but having that conversation begins to deal with racism directly, and I applaud him for that because I think that's a thoughtful approach. But for my kids in the room, I think that, particularly for my first-year law students who are trying to get their sea legs in law school, the notion that you came, and in your personal statements, you talked about social justice and racial justice, understanding at core that that is not only a principled reason for you to be in this institution, but that you not leave that and that you recognize to be in the fight for racial justice and social justice in this country means that you have to have skin in the game. It doesn't mean that you only protest when it's nice. Brian and I were talking about this earlier. Brian and I have known each other for a very long time. But it means that you have to realize that by putting yourself out there, there's sometimes a cost associated with that. But that's what people struggled for in the civil rights movement. That's what people continue to struggle for. So keep that in your equation and your decision-making process as you go out and you fight injustice.
I agree with both of the positions that Bert and Tony took. I guess the one thing I would add is that I worry that when we see something like Charlottesville, that we think that it's an isolated incident and that we begin to react to that. And I think, as Brian mentioned earlier, Charlottesville is symptomatic of some deeper problems. And so what I think lawyers and law students can do is recognize how those deeper problems manifest in this country and to begin to find ways to fight the fight on behalf of people who don't have a voice, who don't get to sit up front on the stage, who actually don't have the money to express themselves, who are actually being harmed by the policies and practices that are reflective of this notion of white supremacy and are intent on keeping marginalized people down. So if we look at some of the things that the Trump administration is doing, not only his toxic rhetoric and not only his cabinet picks, but look at some of his policies, we need to fight those. We need to stand up and find ways to fight all of his efforts to get rid of DACA. We need to find ways to begin to enable our communities to feel safe in their communities and not to feel like they are at war with their police. We need to find ways as lawyers to challenge the kinds of policies that that administration is putting forward and trying to suggest are normal policies, because they're not normal policies. So I love the fact that we have, you know, attorneys general in states actually using the law to say this is a Muslim ban and we need to stop it. That's what lawyers can do. We can actually fight things in court and begin to make a change there. But we also have to not be satisfied with a win in court or a battle in court. We actually do have to contribute to the narrative. So we need to be out there writing op-ed pieces, engaging the public debate, actually talking to people about why race is important to at least acknowledge, and that we need to acknowledge that legacy of racism in this country before we will begin to move on. Because until we do that, until we recognize that that's our role as lawyers, as citizens, this won't change.
It's just hard to add anything more to that, but I do think that it is important for all of us. If you find yourself on issues of race only ever reacting to things that come along, then my argument is that you're not doing enough. We don't need more people just reacting when something happens here and there. We need people who are prepared to commit to doing something proactive. And what's great about NYU is this law school actually provides lots of opportunities to engage in proactive struggle to confront racial inequality and racial justice, and I think you have to get involved. You cannot, in my judgment, prepare yourself to create a different conversation 50 years from now if you stay in your classrooms, if you talk only to yourselves, if you allow yourself, because you're in law school, to be disengaged from this larger struggle. We need you to be involved in the broader struggle, active in the broader struggle, and you need to stay connected to communities that are suffering from racial inequality. You have to get underneath the policy discussions. What happens in law school a lot of times, we get so focused on policy and precedent that we don't talk about the narratives behind the policy and precedent. If you're talking about Korematsu, you can't just look at the holding of that case. You actually have to ask yourself, how did my country get comfortable with rounding up people who are Japanese American and putting them in concentration camps, and nobody said anything? How did we get comfortable with that? We got comfortable with that because of this narrative of fear and anger. And right now, we're living at a time when the narrative, the politics of fear and anger are raging. We've got politicians that want us afraid and they want us angry, and if we allow ourselves to be governed by fear and anger, we will tolerate abuse, inequality, injustice. We'll accept people being rounded up because of their religion or their faith or their ethnicity. And we have to change that narrative. And I also think we actually have to stay committed to being hopeful, because that's the other thing that I think is the biggest threat to doing racial justice work. You lose your hope. You think, oh, I can't do anything about that. Law school is notorious for taking away your hope quotient. It really is. Because these people up here, some of these folks right up here, complicate the world. They make these things really, and they should. That's their job, to complicate things, because you need to be smart and tactical. But sometimes what happens is that you begin to think, well, I can't do anything about that. We can't solve these problems. And you actually have to fight against the hopelessness that will make you think that there's nothing more we can do. That is the biggest problem we have. And in fact, my view is that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. And you're either hopeful or you're the problem. So when I meet hopeless law students, I hate to tell you this, but you're kind of problems. And so you've got to hold on to your hope. And then the last thing you have to do is that you have to be willing to do uncomfortable things. As Tony said, there's no way you can make a difference on these kinds of issues that have been festering for centuries. If you think the only thing you can do is something that's convenient or comfortable, you have to do inconvenient things and uncomfortable things. Some of you are going to have to be the person who stands up when everybody else is saying, sit down. Some of you are going to have to be the person who speaks when everybody else is saying, be quiet. But when you do that with some commitment to these changes and these issues, that's when things change. And that's what I think we can do. And law shouldn't silence us in the quest to do that justice. And that's what excites me about being here. But it also worries me sometimes. And that's why I think it's great that people come out to conversations like this. We've got a challenge in front of us, and we've got to meet that challenge.
The long distance aspect of it is what I want to stress. When I first started, I mean, I became a civil rights lawyer or civil liberties lawyer in 1967, and I thought it would take about 10 years to fix everything. 10 good hard years, staying up late at night, working on the stuff. One of the things we all have to acknowledge is that the process of moving toward a better humanity for us all is a never-ending process. You never, in my lifetime, in the lifetimes of these wonderful people on the panel with me, we're never going to do much more than make a dent. But making the dent over time and over generations changes things. It is a different country than the country I grew up in, a better country. We're on the cusp of tilting backwards a little bit, and that makes me very nervous. But the progress is a real progress. Look at this stage. I mean, I've been in the civil rights, civil liberties movement most of my life. I've never before sat on a stage with 3 black peers. When I started, it wouldn't have happened. They weren't there. They're now here, and the world is changing. And so you can help it change. And I'll just end in what may be on a discordant note. And that's that there are things that unite us as well as things that divide us. We're different in race. We're different in religion. We're different in ideology. We're different. But the things that unite us, the economic issues that unite us, that make it possible for powerful people in the society to play the weak off against each other by hoping that they will compete for who the worst victim is and who the champion victim is and how much time should be spent on that. Every single time we fall for that, we add another 50 years to the problem. One of the things we must remember is that what binds most minorities together is economic oppression. And the economic oppression will not go away unless we think about policies that unite us in a common good, rather than just getting into silos and trying to advance our own silos.
Thank you to this panel. This is the beginning of the school year, and I hope you'll think that this is just the beginning of a conversation. Of course, these issues didn't begin with Charlottesville, as everyone has recognized, and they won't end anytime soon. But I hope that our community continue to take them up in all of the ways that have been described tonight. So again, thank you all for being here, and thanks to our panelists.